This is the seventh week's lecture slides, but actually it's a sixth session. Obviously, week 6 was was the research week, which some of you participated in. So this really is the centre of the module, and what I focus on here, what I'm planning on focusing on here, is risk and uncertainty. For me, I put this in the centre of the module on purpose. It sums up to me what really is a fundamental aspect of projects and project management, and a real concern for understanding projects, understanding why they fail, understanding how they can be more successful, broadly understanding some of the issues around project failure, project delivery, some of the things that should concern project managers that often, and I think frequently, don't. So try to examine in this session, try to examine what we mean by risk, what we mean by uncertainty, try to unpack that a little bit, and then talk about a fairly orthodox perspective on risk management, and then move on to some of the more critical aspects of thinking about risk and its role and uncertainty and their role in projects. So here's a couple of definitions of risk and risk management. Risk is, as you can see in the first quote there, the probability that a particular adverse event, so something which is an event which is against what we hope to happen, that adverse event occurs during a stated period of time or results from a particular challenge. Okay, so something's happening in some sort of undertaking we're carrying out, and something's gone wrong. A challenge has created problems for us, or we're encountering some problems. This is only an issue if that event leads to some sort of harm, and harm in this definition is loss. Okay, loss can take many forms, and it normally takes the form of some sort of damage to our undertaking. Okay, so risk management, in the second quote there, is the systematic process of identifying, analysing and responding to uncertainty. Now, the interesting thing here is that the Project Management Institute, from where this definition of risk management comes, immediately conflates uncertainty and risk. They essentially call risk management a response to uncertainty. These things are distinct, and I'll try to explain why I think they're distinct. Okay, but anyway, uncertainty as project-related events or conditions which are not definitely known with the potential of adverse consequences on a project objective. So what they're looking at is adverse consequences on a project objective. So the harm within a project is the impact it might have on the objectives or the goals of the project. Okay, so a little bit about what we mean by risk. Risk is a function of, broadly speaking, a function of uniqueness and or complexity within a project. These often are equated, but they can be different things. You can have a very complex project which has less of an element of uniqueness than what might be a much more simple but very unique project. So you need to be careful about relating uniqueness and complexity together, but broadly speaking, they normally come together. And it's also a function of experience and stability of the project team. At least this is what Nicholas says. You can see this is reference to Nicholas and his book Project Management for Business and Engineering. So here what he argues is that with experience and stability, project teams develop an understanding of risk and how this may impact on their project. So broadly speaking, Nicholas argues that uniqueness and complexity will lead to greater risk. Experience and stability will help a project team to reduce or understand that risk and manage it much more effectively. Some of the key concepts here: the likelihood that some probability or event will occur. So we're talking about a probabilistic content issue. And now this is where this relates very closely to what we talked about in a previous session, I think session 4, PERT. So it's about likelihood that something which we don't want to happen happens, and then should that happen, what the impact might be. So I'll talk you through some of this over the remainder of the session. So we can think of risk as a function of likelihood and impact. What's the likelihood of an event occurring, which is something we don't want, and were that to occur, what sort of impact would it have? And I'll pick up on that in some detail later in this session. Okay, so let's return to a bit of theory. So there are a number of ways of looking at risk. The one which we, I guess, understand and which makes sense to a lot of people is what we broadly class as economic theories of risk. These are things like game theory, economic utility theory, which I'll touch upon in a moment, and many others. So risk is seen as a facet or a phenomenon which can be understood through economic analysis. That's one way of thinking about risk. Perhaps as human beings, much more useful to us is to think about risks from a psychological and social perspective. From a psychological perspective, we have cognitive heuristics, the way our brains think, the way we understand the world, and also psychometric perspectives, our broad understanding and appreciation of risk, what we see as risky, what we don't see as risky. And this is partly a function of ontology, partly a function of epistemology. Okay, so there we have psychological theories of risk. Risk is also a social construct, or can be seen as a social construct. And here I've got a couple of examples. The cultural theory of risk, which is very much developed by Mary Douglas, Aaron Wydwowski. These were important thinkers in the cultural theory of risk. And it's about, in broad terms, it's about the way that different cultures take different perspectives on risk. Some cultures are very risk tolerant, other cultures are more risk adverse. You can look at examples, might be some societies, such as East Asian societies, South Asian societies, some parts of Europe are very risk adverse. Other societies, broadly speaking, Anglo-Saxon societies, so North America, United Kingdom, Australia, those sort of areas, have it's been shown to have a much more of a tolerance to risk. So that's one perspective on risk, a social theory of risk. Another is about something which I picked up in my research with colleagues about rationality and deliberate ignorance of risk. So I'll pick up on that point right towards the end of this session, because it is something that I've been particularly interested in some of my past research. Okay, so let's unpack this issue of risk and uncertainty. Talk about risk and uncertainty, and in the literature, indeed in work I've produced in my research, these terms get conflated. I'm as guilty of that as other people. So let's try to be a bit careful about what we mean by risk and uncertainty. Now, this picture up in the corner here is of Frank Knight, very famous economist, American economist, who came up with, actually quite late on, a way of thinking about risk and uncertainty. So he came up with what we now regard as pretty much the orthodox position. You can see this is as late as 1921, where he was a proponent of expected utility theory, which I won't go into any detail here, but from his point of view, the way he unpacked risk and uncertainty was to think about it as randomness, but randomness which can be measured or not measured. So for him, for Knight, and really the way we think about risk in modern society is risk is randomness, so something which may or may not happen. We don't know whether it's going to happen or not, but to which we can apply some sort of mathematical probability. We can measure it in some way, the chances of something happening. Okay, so it's about statistics. Uncertainty, on the other hand, is randomness which can't be expressed in terms of mathematical probabilities. In other words, it's beyond our ability to measure. It doesn't mean it can't be measured, it just means that we don't have the data or the ability or the knowledge to measure that randomness. Okay, and I'll try to think about that in more detail in a moment. Another way of thinking about risk and uncertainty, unpacking them, Anderson came up with this perspective, much more of a behavioural perspective. And this is also, I think, quite common in the discourse, and it really is very much understood, particularly from a strategic point of view. Risk management, so the management of risk, is a defensive process. It's about putting up barriers around projects, defending the project goals and objectives from things which may interrupt the process of delivering the project. For Anderson, uncertainty is about threats, but also about opportunities, things which we hadn't expected or had emerged, which we weren't aware of, but which can help us deliver opportunities or maybe more strategic benefits from the project, which we hadn't anticipated. So there's two different perspectives on risk. I think, broadly speaking, for most people, taking the first one about risk being something we can measure and understand statistically, and uncertainty be something we are unable to measure, is probably the most useful way of thinking about risk and uncertainty and the distinction between them. Okay, so some research I've done with colleagues and was published in our book Project Resilience was something we call the risk horizon. Now imagine you're an observer in the centre there, and you have to imagine that everything you can see, imagine you're in a valley, and everything you can see in that valley is risk. You can look at it, you can observe it, you can measure it. And that's what we call, and then outside there, beyond the hills, beyond the peaks of the valley, is the rest of the world. Something unknown, something we can't understand. We don't know what's out there. We can have guesses, maybe, but we don't know for sure what is out there. Now, everything we can see within the valley is what we call the risk horizon. So you can think of the horizon is everything you can make sense of, measure, think about what might happen, what might not happen. Okay, so it's the risk horizon. In terms of risk management, it's about everything we can sensibly understand and make sense of, which may have an impact on our project. Beyond that is uncertainty. Now, this isn't a static model, it's a dynamic model. So the more data we gather, the more we can bleed that risk horizon into uncertainty, so uncertainty becomes part of our risk. The way to think about this is, well, we're in a valley, all we can see is the boundaries of the valley. What happens if we climb up to the top of the hill and look over the rest of the world? Maybe we're in a deeper valley, but okay, we can see more now. And if we can see more, we can make sense of what's there. So this risk horizon, as we gather more data, as we do more investigations, so we try to understand uncertainty, we can bleed that risk horizon into uncertainty, encompass more uncertainty into risk. So uncertainty and risk aren't static things, they move, they're shifting all the time. And really, we set our own horizons. We decide what we're going to investigate, what we're not going to investigate, what we're going to try and make sense of, what we're not going to try and make sense of. Okay, so this is quite a useful way of thinking about what people do in projects when they're trying to make sense of risk. Okay, so risk and uncertainty, I'm conflating them here, but broadly speaking, things which we don't know for certain may or may not happen, okay, can impact a project in a number of ways. They can impact our goals. What are we trying to achieve? So that's one way the risk can impact upon us. It can also impact on the way we try to deliver something. So changes in the way of working in the project. Finally, it can impact on our relations among stakeholders and between each other within projects. So this is about epistemological and ontological differences about what constitutes risk. What is risky? What isn't risky? What's our tolerance to risk? How risk averse are we? So this is picking up on those relational, social, and cognitive aspects of risk here. In projects, when we're thinking about risk in projects, well, certainly all projects are risky, all undertakings are risky, everything we do is risky, but projects are particularly risky because we're undertaking something which is generally speaking, never been done before. So if you think about some of the definitions of projects, they're unique undertakings, they've never been done before in quite the way they're done, or in the context or setting they're being carried out. That is the definition, one of the definitions of a project. So if we're going into the unknown, that unknown activity is going to contain substantial amounts of risk. Much more certainly than more operational activities. If you think about a factory producing something, it does something over and over and over again. What we're doing is driving out risk. Within projects, we're inviting risk. Okay? Now, those projects which have high risk, generally speaking, have high return. Similarly, low risk projects have low risk return. All projects contain risk, and this makes us think about objectives, what must be delivered, and uncertainty, what might happen, which either interrupts those objectives or enables us to achieve those objectives. So really I'm thinking here more of Anders's perspective, behavioural views of risk and uncertainty. Okay, so let's think a bit about risk analysis. So risk can impact on project outputs in terms of technical targets, what we're trying to achieve, in terms of time and in terms of cost. So there's the iron triangle there, the time, cost, and broadly speaking quality or scope, or whatever you want to call the third part of the triangle, point of the triangle. And risk can affect project outcomes and objectives. So I'm distinguishing here between outputs and outcomes or objectives. So the outputs are time, cost, quality, the deliverables of the project. The project also has broader goals. There's no point in doing a project unless it has some sort of strategic intent. This may be business objectives or needs of stakeholders or users who might benefit from the project outputs, or longer term use and relevance of the project outputs. To what extent does this the outputs of this project help society or an organisation over the longer term? So risk happens in projects, as we've seen. I've said here there's broadly a inverse relationship between probability and cost impact throughout the project life cycle. So most risks are reduced or eliminated at the start of the project. Okay, so what we do in organisations, in project organisations, is try to understand risks and think about how we can prevent them from happening in the first place, what we can do to keep them out of the project activity. But should they remain, should we have a risk which is going to impact upon the project, then this will have a greater impact on the project the later it occurs. So this model, this graph, is out of Larson and Gray's book. You can see that the chance of risk or events occurring, or the way we think about risk, is very high at the beginning of the project, and what we try to do is drive it out as the project occurs, as the project happens. Risks are eliminated, closed off, removed from the project activities. However, in the early stages where we're defining and planning a project, the relative impact of risk is quite low. We can manage it, we can deal with it, and recover from it very easily. As we get towards the end of the project, the impact of those risks becomes relatively high. And so the impact or cost to fix problems becomes higher later in the project life cycle. You can see the project life cycles along the bottom of that diagram there. Why do we use risk management? Okay, in some ways it's self-evident that we're seeking to ensure that the project is going to be delivered successfully in terms of time, cost and quality, that it delivers the strategic benefits we hope it's going to deliver. Okay. In reality, well, it's a cost. It's an additional cost to the project. So it needs to often be mandated that we have risk management, and it's required by customer or written into a contract process. So project teams, will they manage the risk? Will they not manage the risk? Well, they have a budget, and carrying out risk management is an impact on that budget. It also takes time to do. Whilst you're spending time on risk management, you're not delivering the project. So there's a disincentive to carry out risk management. So it needs to be mandated in some way. It's often required by internal procedures. So the Project Management Institute, the Association of Project Management, as APM, or organisations and processes like Prince2 are often have a large element of risk management built into the process of delivering a project. And these are some of the logos of those organisations. In reality, it might be the fear of failure. Well, we'd better do some risk management, a project manager might say, or else we stand a chance of the project failing in some way. We don't know how that may fail. It may fail, but it could fail, unless we think about the risks involved in the project. Or what are we doing? Crossing our fingers and hoping, praying that the risk doesn't emerge in some way. Maybe it's just me too. Project managers see other people carrying out risk management. They get taught it at university, like you are being now, and they think, well, maybe I should be doing this. Perhaps it provides significant benefits. I think it does. Okay, and the literature thinks it does, but the statistical evidence for that is rather lacking. There's not much research into risk and risk management. The interesting thing is having a risk management process does not mean it will be either effectively employed or even employed at all. This is based on some research I've done, and I found that project teams, they get on with the project, they're starting to deliver the project, they get to the point where they think, oh, we better think about the risk. They do it in a perfunctory way maybe, or maybe just skip that stage and just carry on. And so there we are, I've got a reference to some of the research I did with my colleague Elmar some years ago. You can see that's a paper we published. Okay, so in the teaching session I talked about the Death Star. This is from Return of the Jedi. I showed you a little clip from Return of the Jedi. What I was thinking about here is who was involved in the building of the Death Star. Not stormtroopers, that's for sure. Contractors, specialists would be involved in building this major undertaking. Then I talked a bit about, I showed you a little clip of where this is discussed in a film, so you can look up the film Clerks. There's the YouTube link at the top of the in grayed out at the top of the slide there. Okay, so what are the aims of risk management? The risk management process, so what I'm going to get into here now is to focus on a fairly orthodox way of thinking about risk management within projects, and how this turns into a process which will take you through the major steps in risk management. It gets articulated in all sorts of ways, but essentially this is a reification of the risk management process. So the aims are to, in the first place, comprehensively identify as many risks as possible. What we're doing here is turning uncertainty into risk, okay, by identifying everything that might happen. If we can identify it, look at it, make sense of it, then it's a risk. If we don't know about it, or haven't identified it, or haven't thought about it, it's uncertainty, okay, as I talked about in my model, the risk horizon, earlier. Okay, so comprehensive identification, objective assessment and understanding. We assume objectivity here. Of course, in reality, there's a lot less objectivity than we like to think, but nevertheless, objective assessment and understanding of those risks we've identified. Then, a current diagnosis of the position of the project team, of the project itself, in relationship to those risks we've identified. Then, strategies for dealing with those risks we've identified, what sort of response we should take. And then finally, a focused management attention on thinking about the risks, having a mindful relationship to those risks throughout the delivery of the project. The aims of the process are, in the first place, to eliminate uncertainty. That's avoiding risk. Okay. To transfer. After that, there'll be a whole load of risk left over to transfer the liability or ownership of a proportion of those risks. That's a transferring process, maybe to suppliers, maybe to other stakeholders, maybe to the customer or client or owner, maybe to third parties such as insurers. Then, whatever's left over, we try to reduce to an acceptable level. We mitigate against risk. And finally, whatever's left over after all those processes is the residual, and we try to control that. So we can think about the risk management process as a step-by-step model. Step 1, identify the risk. Analyse the project and think about the sources of risk to the project objectives. Step 2, assess those risks. So we've identified them, now we'll assess them. In terms of assessment, what we're looking at is going right back to the beginning of this session, the severity of impact should it occur, the likelihood of it occurring in the first instance, and to the extent to which we can control the outcome of the risk or even the chances of it happening. In this process, new risks will emerge, and we go back and to the beginning of the process. Step 3, develop a response. What sort of strategy will we have in place to prevent or reduce possible damage to the project delivery? What sort of contingency plans have we got in place should something adverse occur? New risks might emerge. We go through the process of identifying them, assessing them, and developing a response. New risks might emerge in this process, and we carry on doing this process. It's an iterative process. Finally, step 4, control the risk response. So we implement some sort of risk strategy, monitor and adjust the plan for new risks which might be emerging, which we hadn't thought of earlier, and manage change within the project, which is realistically the biggest risk of all. And again, new risks may occur. So what we can see is this is a stepwise process, but an iterative process as well. So keep going back and going back and going back. In terms of flowchart, we start with the risk management strategy and planning. This takes us through to, which sets up our approach. We then go into risk identification. What are the risks? What do they look like? What's their nature? That enables us to produce a list, literally a list of all the risks we have. This can be in some sort of database or simply on an Excel spreadsheet or something like that. Each of those risks we've identified, we analyse. We can look at risks in terms of qualitative measures or in terms of quantitative measures. Both are effective, both are very useful ways of thinking about risks. This enables us to develop a risk matrix. And with the risk matrix, we can start to identify how we're going to respond to some risks. Other risks we might ignore, and I'll come to why we might do that in a moment. Okay, some risks are manageable. We can do something with them. We can maybe insure against them, or we can eliminate them in some way. So those are manageable risks. And for those who have an action plan, what are we going to do with each of these risks? Others are critical risks. These are risks that will have a serious impact on the project and are highly likely to happen. We have a contingency plan to deal with those risks should they occur. They're not definitely going to happen, but we think there's a good chance they'll happen. And then we monitor our plan. What's going on as the project proceeds, and do we need to invoke the plan at any point? And then this is again an iterative process. So picking our way through this a little bit in more detail, let's start with the risk management strategy and planning. This is how we're going to go about the process of identifying risks in the first place. So we have a strategy. How will the risk management process be undertaken? In what ways are we going to do this? Who's going to be involved? Who's going to carry out that process? In what ways is it going to be integrated with the project approach? We have a risk plan. and this is normally part of this early stage of a strategy and planning. So we have a risk plan, which will be the scopes and objectives of the risk process, how long we're going to spend on it, how much time we're going to put into it, roles and responsibilities of participants, who's going to be involved in the risk management process, what are the deliverables, a plan of some kind, is there an endpoint, or do we carry on with this process right through the project, how much effort and resource will be required, how expensive will this be, and how are we going to price that as part of the project delivery. We're going to think about the review and reporting of risks. Is this on a monthly basis or a weekly basis or some other regular basis within the project? Maybe it's a continuous process, so we maybe have frequent reviews, and if new risks emerge or something happens, then we can go back to our risk plan. And finally, this needs to be integrated into the overall project plan. Okay, so the next step was risk identification, if you recall. So normally speaking, this will be some sort of team-based activity. A whole variety of people will come together within the project to think about risks. It's often outside experts or people who've been working on similar projects in the past will be employed to provide additional expertise. There are experts in just the risk management process, consultants who can be brought in to help think about risk and its possible impacts on the project. All sorts of brainstorming techniques are used in order to think about risk and how it can be understood within a particular project. We ask, what could go wrong? All sorts of things could go wrong, obviously, so we have to think about whether these are internal or external to the project, whether they're related to suppliers or customers or what. Okay, so we think about what can go wrong and the nature of each of those things we've identified. We concentrate on identifying causes, not just effects. So Ishikawa type diagrams, that's what we often call the fishbone diagram. Other approaches to cause and effect. So were this to happen, what would be the cause of that? Let's tackle the causes rather than the effects. And in doing so, what we do is snuff out the chance of a risk occurring within the project, or seek to do that anyway. Often use the work breakdown structure or process breakdown structure as a guide. So here are the activities we've got. Let's think about the risk to each of those activities. That's a good way of kind of helping to structure this process of risk identification for the project we're carrying out. The next step is risk analysis. So we've identified the risks, then we need to think about how we're going to make sense of them. So we think about which risks can be managed, which can't be managed. That's our first step. Which take priority for management attention, and when we should invest in contingency arrangements. So, still on step 3, risk analysis, what we're trying to do is think about likelihood and impact. If you recall, that's something I mentioned right at the beginning. What's the chance of something happening? Broadly speaking, high, medium, or low, or you could express that as a percentage chance, a normal distribution curve, a bit like we did with PERT. And were it to happen, what's its likely impact? In other words, how much of a cost or time delay or threat to the deliverables would this risk be? We can understand these in terms of a matrix. So if the likelihood is, you look on the y-axis, if the likelihood is low and then on the x-axis if the impact is low, then we aren't too worried about his risks. It's very unlikely to happen, and were it to happen, we don't think it'd have much impact on the project. Where the likelihood is high and the likely impact is high, then those are critical or high important risks for us to think about. Those are the ones we need to worry about. We think there's a reasonably high or very high chance they're going to occur, and were they to occur, this would have a major impact on our project. Okay, so this is the risk matrix I was talking about earlier. And here's a risk list. So here's a list which I've put together of various risks to a particular project. I'm not going into too much detail about this, but you can see that the risks are in a list and there's a number of them. Some are, this actually start at 1 and go to maybe hundreds, but these some are picked up as examples. And the likelihood of problems being encountered, this risk occurring, and the impact should it occur. And then these can be arrayed across the matrix, as you'll see in the next slide. So there we are. So some of those risks are up in the critical area. Those are high risks to our project objectives, the aims of the project, the goals of the project, or maybe the outputs of the project. And those are the ones we're going to concentrate on, the ones in the orange and red areas up there. The ones down in the green areas aren't going to worry about too much. Their chances of them happening are pretty low, and should they happen, it won't have a major impact on our project. Still in step 3, what we've just talked about is really qualitative ways of thinking about risk, but we can look at it in terms of quantitative analysis as well. This is often done within projects where we have plenty of data and some sort of way of measuring those data. So we express likelihood as a percentage chance of that risk happening. We express the impact normally in terms of value. What's the impact in terms of cost should that risk happen? Time impacts can be expressed as cost. So what's the time effect of a delay to the project delivery in terms of use of the project, or in terms of market share, which would be lost if the project were late in being delivered, or whatever. We multiply one by the other, and that can then give us a single number, which can then be compared against other risks across the project. There's lots of software we can use, or sophisticated methods we can use to think about risk. I'm not going to go into detail about these, but apart from I have gone into detail about PERT, which is the obvious way of thinking about risk probability within a project, and you can also use PERT to say cost impact as well, cost probability. FMEA is failure mode effect analysis, Monte Carlo simulation methods, and all sorts of other methods we can use. Finally, we have our response. Well, not quite finally, but we have our response. Having identified and analysed the risk, the question arises, what do we do? How do we respond? So here we are in step 4, the control of the risk response. So we try to go back to those 4 points I made earlier. We mitigate. We try to reduce the risk, reduce the probability that the risk will occur by doing things differently maybe, or reduce the impact such an event would have on the project should it occur. In other words, reduce the vulnerability of the project to risks. Maybe by replanning it, maybe by doing things differently, by reordering the network or whatever. We try to avoid risk, prevent risk happening in the first place by changing the project plan. We can transfer risk. We can pay premium to pass the risk on to other parties, third parties. Something I'll talk about later in the module, things like PPP type contracts can be used as a very effective way to transfer risk from customers or owners to suppliers and financiers. And finally, we can contain risk. We can make a conscious decision to accept some risk. Why would we do that? Maybe to save costs. It costs money to transfer risk or to take actions to prevent risk happening. Maybe we think, well, they're not a high probability, or we'll take a chance, and so we'll make a conscious decision to accept risk. Maybe the organisation carrying out the risk management process is best placed to manage those risks or to make sense of those risks. Here we are. Finally, we monitor and control the process. So we need to define a risk management group, some group of people within the project team, maybe sometimes just one person who's responsible for thinking about risk and what risks are happening or might happen at various stages of the project, and what our plan is to deal with that. To integrate the risk plan into the main project plans, to define and implement mechanisms for monitoring and reporting risks. So what's going on in the project, who needs to know about that, and progress against risk plans and update the risk management plans. This is normally on a regular basis. And in that process, in those meetings, which we would have on a regular basis, which would be just project process meetings normally, part of that will be what risks are going on. So we have to look at the risk log. Is that being maintained and updated with new information? Check that the execution of the planned actions is happening and is delivering what we thought it would deliver. Watch for early warning signs, so those weak signals, early signals that something may be going wrong. Catch them, nip them in the bud. Identify trends to help predict risks. Is something happening? Has it happened again? 2 points might make a trend. And check the risk management is being applied effectively. So a number of things which we're doing on a regular basis to help think about and manage risk within the project. Who's in charge of this? Who's responsible for this? Broadly speaking, everyone is. So if you think about people involved in a project as a team, everyone in the team has to be responsible for a risk. You can't outsource it really to somebody else outside the project. Some people in the project are better placed than other people to manage and deal with risk. So the client or sponsor can think about the risk they're in control of or best place to manage, such as change or strategic change or something going on like that. The project manager can deal with often specific risks around the interface between the project and the stakeholders. The project team can manage the internal risk to the specific aspects of different activities which are occurring, and maybe other stakeholders can help manage other risks as well. So the client and sponsor is responsible broadly for the business benefits, the project manager for the project objectives, the project team, and maybe other stakeholders for specific tasks and activities with the project. Okay, so that's where we've got to. That's the orthodox view of risk. We know what should happen. We know what risk management involves, or at least have an idea of that, or you should hopefully by now. But let's ask ourselves, what does happen, why does it happen, and what are the consequences? Here's a, I think, very useful quote which we've used in some of our research thinking about risk. So what Frostick said in this quote was that the techniques of risk estimation are largely quantitatively based and make claims of scientific objectivity. Okay, so we think of ourselves as rational people carrying out business activities, one of which may be delivery of projects. And we try to do this in a scientific, rational way. Now, Frostick says this is undermined on several fronts. So there are question marks about the extent to which event and reliability data itself can be relied on for accuracy. So we don't know really. We're making a lot of guesses, a lot of assumptions and about the data we have for understanding the nature of risk, the likelihood of it occurring, and what impact it may have. In the absence of adequate data, the assignment of probabilities is frankly a subjective process. So though we think we're doing something very quantitative, very scientific, actually it all starts somewhere. It all starts with somebody making a decision about something to do with the risk related to the project. Or at least that's what Frostick argues. And I think he's right in saying this. One of my colleagues and friends, actually, Robin Holt, worked on thinking about this in relationship to a major project which was the Terminal 5 project for Heathrow, a massive project at the time, the biggest project in Europe, many billions of pounds worth of work. Okay, he came with this model taken from problem theory, which categorises risks into these four categories: tame, messy, and wicked. And then he added to these categories wicked messes. The way he looked at this was I've tried to show in this model here that we can think about risks in terms of technical complexity and behavioural complexity. Technical complexity is about things that are delivered, actual things, tangible things which are being delivered. Some projects are highly complex technical processes, others are more about people. So what's the technical complexity involved in the project, and then what's the behavioural complexity. Okay, what are the relationships? How many people are involved? What's the nature of the stakeholders? What's the nature of the strategy behind the project? Now, for Robin Holt, where there's low behavioural complexity, then the solution is technical or scientific. We can deal with technical issues and resolve those. Maybe they're quite difficult to resolve, but we can use various methods to think through and tackle the technical problems we might face. Where the problems are behavioural, then we haven't got the straightforward solutions. We can only make resolutions. We can try to resolve the social issues, the political issues, ethics which we might face, moral hazards and moral problems, and behavioural problems. So thinking about this as a bit of a different model, here we've got tame problems. We can maybe understand why they're problems, how they're problems, and we can solve them. We can gather and analyse data, formulate and implement some sort of solution. Where the problem is messy, that's a highly complex technical problem we're facing, then we might know why it's a problem, but not necessarily how it's a problem. So all we can do is resolve that messiness. Cross-functional groups, pictures, systems engineering, that sort of thing. Where the problem is wicked, well, here we don't necessarily know why it's a problem or how it's a problem even. All we can do is what Robin calls dissolving that wickedness. We can satisfy, which means nobody is fully satisfied, but we create the best balance of satisfactory solutions across the stakeholder community. We can use things like Moscow methods. What must we have, should we have, could we have, and would we really like to deliver in the project? So there's lots of things we can do to manage that wickedness. You'll notice that he hasn't got anything for wicked messes, which are highly complex technical and behavioural problems in unison. Okay, so we're nearing the end here. Some of the research I've done with my colleague and friend Elmar Kutsch looked at behavioural reasons for, despite risk, we've got all this risk management process in place, there's behavioural reasons that we found for why people don't actually, in fact, do, or if they do the risk management process, they don't do it in any meaningful way. We identified with some intervening conditions. You can see the couple of papers we've published here. In the first one, we try to identify the way people's attitudes to uncertainty. They deny that uncertainty can even exist, or deny the presence of uncertainty. If they accept uncertainty, then they avoid it. They avoid tackling it, avoid coping with it, avoid dealing with it. If they do deal with it, then they delay until it's too late. They try to keep their options open, we found. And then, on top of all that, there's ignorance. People just don't know what risk and risk management is, what the nature of the risk might be, what the nature of uncertainty is, and the relationship between the two. What we've also found, as we published in another paper, is that actually it's not irrational to implement a risk management, to fail to implement a risk management process. If you are first of all, nobody likes to be a do maker, to go to somebody and say, here we are, here's all sorts of things that can go wrong. No one wants to talk about things that can go wrong. Everyone wants to be optimistic. So essentially, people in projects have an optimism bias. And even if they do understand risk and are prepared to say it and talk about it, they don't want to talk about it because this may actually either scare or make customers and owners reassess what their approach to this. Maybe we shouldn't do this project. Maybe it's too risky. Maybe it's too much of a capital risk. Maybe we should do something else instead. Maybe it's not really that needed after all. Maybe we can find different ways of delivering what we want to deliver without carrying out a project. You talk about risk, then this will encourage a customer or an owner to reassess their involvement in the project. And that puts you out of a job. Okay, so why would people talk about risk? So what we found is that it's actually rational to not talk about risk, to not do risk management, or to do it in a very perfunctory and offhand kind of way. Okay, so some of the things I've talked about. Risk is a ubiquitous phenomenon in society and inevitable in all projects. Really is inevitable. It is perhaps one of the biggest challenges, I think the biggest challenge to project management, technically and behaviourally. You as students need to understand the risk and uncertainty relationship. What do we mean by risk? What do we mean by uncertainty? How is it distinct but related? Okay. Sources of project risk are either internal or external, and there are different strategies for managing those. There are many sophisticated tools and techniques for risk analysis and quantification, such as failure mode effective analysis, PERT, Monte Carlo simulation, and so forth. And finally, critically, having a risk management process does not mean it will be effectively employed or employed at all. Maybe you want to think about why this might be the case.